There's a dog in a box. The box is divided into two sections by a low barrier, low enough that the dog could easily jump over it. On the floor of one section, there is an electric grid. When the grid is activated, it delivers a mild but unpleasant shock to the dog's feet. In most experiments like this, what happens next is entirely predictable. The dog feels the shock, searches for an escape, discovers that it can jump the barrier, jumps, and the problem is solved. Simple. Instinctive. Exactly what any living creature with functioning survival instincts would do. But this dog does not jump. This dog does not search for an escape. It does not test the barrier. It does not try. Instead, it lies down on the electrified floor, tucks its legs beneath its body, and quietly endures the shocks. Not because it is physically incapable of escaping, not because it has been restrained or sedated, but because it has learned, through a series of earlier experiences, that nothing it does makes any difference, that the shocks come regardless, that its actions are meaningless. It has learned to be helpless, and that lesson once learned holds even when the world changes and escape becomes possible. The dog cannot update its belief with new evidence because the belief has become something deeper than a thought. It has become an assumption, a settled, invisible, foundational assumption about how reality works. If you have ever stayed in a situation you knew was wrong because some quiet voice inside you said there's no point trying to leave, you already understand what this dog experienced, and that is exactly why this study matters so much. Welcome back to The Darkest Experiments. We've spent this chapter exploring what happens when environment overrides character, when the situation we are placed in reshapes who we become. We've been inside Zimbardo's prison and Rosenhan's psychiatric ward. We've watched people lose their identities, their autonomy, and their credibility to the systems they were placed inside. Now we arrive at the experiment that completes the picture, the one that connects all of that, the prisons, the wards, the uniforms, the labels, to what happens inside the mind of a person who has been powerless for too long. This is the story of learned helplessness. And it is, in the end, a story about hope and about whether the damage done by powerlessness can be undone and what it actually takes to undo it. The year is 1965. Martin Seligman is a young graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania, working in the laboratory of psychologist Richard Seligman, who is conducting research on classical conditioning in dogs. The lab's standard procedure involves placing dogs in harnesses and exposing them to mild electric shocks, part of a conditioning protocol designed to teach them to associate a tone with the shock, so that they would later respond to the tone as if a shock were coming. Standard Pavlovian conditioning. Nothing unexpected, except that something unexpected happens. When the dogs from this conditioning phase are placed in the two-sided box, the shuttle box as it is called, and given the opportunity to escape the shocks by jumping the barrier, they don't. They simply lie there. The researchers try again. Same result. The dogs that had not been through the prior helplessness conditioning jumped immediately and escaped. The conditioned dogs did not move. Seligman, watching this, feels the pull of a question that he cannot let go of. He wants to understand not the conditioning itself, but what it produced. This strange, passive, inexplicable surrender in animals that were physically capable of saving themselves. He designs a new set of experiments to investigate it directly. And what he finds will change the way the entire field of psychology thinks about depression. Seligman and his colleague Stephen Meyer divide dogs into three groups. The first group is placed in harnesses and given electric shocks, but they have a panel they can press with their nose to stop the shocks. They have control. They learn quickly that their actions have consequences. The second group is also placed in harnesses and given electric shocks, but their panel does nothing. The shocks come and go regardless of what they do. They have no control. They can only endure. The third group, the control group, is placed in the harnesses but receives no shocks at all. Then all three groups are moved to the shuttle box. The electrified floor activates. The low barrier is right there, easily cleared. The dogs from the first group, the ones who had learned they could control their shocks, jumped. Quickly, efficiently, they solved the new problem the same way they had solved the previous one. Their actions had mattered before. They assumed their actions would matter again. The dogs from the control group, who had no prior experience with shocks at all, also jumped. Novelty, discomfort, instinct. They searched for escape and found it. The dogs from the second group, the ones who had learned that nothing they did made any difference, lay down. They whimpered. They endured. And when the researchers physically lifted them over the barrier, showing them that the other side was safe, most of them still didn't cross it on their own the next time the shock came. The learning was so deeply embedded that even direct demonstration could not immediately override it. Seligman had a name for what he was observing. He called it learned helplessness, the belief, absorbed through repeated experience of uncontrollability, that one's actions are futile, that the environment cannot be affected by anything you do, and crucially, that this belief, once learned, transfers. It doesn't stay in the context where it was learned. It spreads. It becomes a general orientation toward the world. Seligman was a careful scientist, and he was cautious about drawing direct lines between animal behavior and human experience. But the parallels were impossible to ignore. And when he began looking at clinical depression through the lens of learned helplessness, the fit was striking. People suffering from depression frequently describe precisely this experience. Not sadness exactly, though sadness is there too. But underneath it, a settled, bone-deep conviction that nothing they do will change anything, that trying is pointless, that the world does not respond to their actions, that they are, in some fundamental and irreversible way, without leverage over their own lives. Seligman and his colleagues began to map how learned helplessness develops in humans. Unlike dogs, humans do not need to be physically restrained and shocked. We can learn helplessness through repeated failures in an environment that provides no feedback, no scaffolding, and no encouragement. We can learn it through relationships in which our needs are consistently ignored, through institutions that process us without seeing us, through poverty, through discrimination, through any sustained experience of powerlessness in which our efforts consistently fail to produce results. And just like the dogs, the learning transfers. Someone who learned helplessness in childhood, in a home where their voice didn't matter, where their attempts to change things were consistently futile, carries that learning into adulthood, into new relationships, into new opportunities, filtering them all through the same quiet, invisible assumption: it won't work. There is no point. The experiments themselves, the harnesses, the shocks, the shuttle box, raise real and serious ethical questions about the use of animals in psychological research. The dogs in Seligman's studies experienced genuine, sustained distress. There was no deception here, no illusion of harm. The harm was real. Whether that is justifiable in light of what was learned is a question the scientific community continues to wrestle with. The research directly informed the development of cognitive behavioral therapy, one of the most widely used and empirically supported treatments for depression in existence. It gave clinicians a model for understanding why depressed patients struggle to engage with treatment and what those patients actually need in order to begin to recover. But the suffering of those dogs was real. And it asks us, as it should, to hold both things at once, the knowledge gained and the price paid, without using one to erase the other. Here is where the story takes an important turn, because Seligman did not stop at demonstrating that helplessness could be learned. He went on to ask the next question: can it be unlearned? The answer, it turned out, was yes, but not easily, and not through passive experience. When researchers physically guided the helpless dogs across the barrier, picking them up, moving their legs through the escape motion, repeating it again and again, most of the dogs eventually began to do it themselves. The key was not explanation, not encouragement, not removing the shock. It was directed, assisted, repeated experience of successful action. The body had to relearn through doing what the mind had written off as impossible. In human terms, this finding became one of the cornerstones of modern psychotherapy. The insight that depression is not simply a chemical imbalance or a character flaw or a life philosophy, but a learned pattern of perceiving the relationship between action and outcome, opened the door to treatments that specifically target that pattern, that teach the mind, through carefully structured experience, that actions do have consequences, that the world does respond. That effort is not futile. Seligman went on to become one of the founders of positive psychology, the study not just of what goes wrong in human mental life, but of what allows people to flourish. His work on learned helplessness was, in a sense, the beginning of a lifelong investigation into its opposite, the conditions under which people develop what he called learned optimism, the belief, equally learned, equally transferable, that one's actions matter. Learned helplessness is not a diagnosis. It is not something that only happens to clinical patients or laboratory dogs. It is a human experience available to all of us, under the right conditions. And if you are honest with yourself, you will probably recognize some version of it somewhere in your own life. There will be areas where you stopped trying, where some part of you decided quietly and without announcement that the effort wasn't worth making because the outcome was always going to be the same. A relationship you stopped investing in, a skill you convinced yourself you couldn't develop, a dream you shelved not because you made a clear decision to let it go, but because the accumulated weight of small failures gradually persuaded you it was impossible. What Seligman's research tells us is that this is not a personality trait. It is not who you are. It is a learned response to a specific history of uncontrollability, and learned responses can be unlearned, but only through action, not through insight alone, not through being told that things can be different, through actually doing the thing in a context structured for success and experiencing, in the body, not just the mind, that the outcome changes. The barrier is still there, and it is lower than you think. Martin Seligman began with dogs in harnesses and ended up reshaping the way an entire field thinks about human suffering and human resilience. The experiment was disturbing. The conclusions were profound. And the journey from learned helplessness to learned optimism, from the dog lying on the electrified floor to the human being who rediscovers that their actions matter, is one of the most important journeys in all of psychology. That brings Chapter 2 to a close. We have been inside a mock prison that became a real one. We have walked through the doors of psychiatric hospitals as sane people who could not convince anyone of the fact. And we have watched what happens to a living creature when powerlessness becomes a worldview. In Chapter 3, we turn to the most difficult territory in this entire series. We leave adults behind and enter the world of children, of infants and orphans and kids who trusted the adults around them to keep them safe. What those adults did instead will be among the hardest things in this series to hear. Chapter 3 is called Sins Against the Innocent, and it begins in the next video. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Leave a comment. I want to know if learned helplessness resonated with something in your own experience. And thank you, as always, for being here and for having the courage to look at these things honestly. I'll see you in the next one.